Welcome back to the farmstead. We're glad you're here. My son and I traveled down to Tennessee and met with some really great beekeepers. In today's video, part 1 of 3, we're going to sit down with a really great guy. Now, he's not great because he's a fantastic beekeeper, a family man. What I really appreciate and respect about this individual is he wants to bring people together. He always wants to do the right thing, wants to do the right thing by the bees as well. And I think that's really important. In this video, we're going to get to know the mind behind the beekeeper, what led him to be in the position that he is, and where he wants to move forward to. And I think that's really important for us all to understand. Sometimes when we see really great beekeepers that are up on a pedestal, we never get the opportunity to really dig in and learn who they were before, where they are now, and kind of where they want to go in the future. And I think that's really important to keep in mind as we all grow and try to do better with our bees. What he lacks in height, he more than makes up for in spirit. It's my honor to bring you this interview with Kamon Reynolds. Welcome back to another episode of the Contrary Beekeeper Show. In our last episode with Bob Benny, when we sat down and interviewed him, we mentioned that life has a way of putting people in our path along our journey, and it seems like it's been one thing kind of after another. There are some folks that are brought into your life that are literally shining a light. They're shining a light unto other folks' path. They're gracious, they're humble, they're making a difference, and they're not afraid to do the right thing. Today, it's our honor to have Kamon Reynolds on the podcast. Most of you probably know who Kamon Reynolds is, Tennessee's Bees, on the YouTube channel. Right now, he's on there. And say hi to Kamon's camera. And he's one of the good guys that are in this industry. He's a young guy, but he spends a lot of time not only teaching folks about bees, but he's the kind of guy that reaches out and actually helps. He wants to see people do well. And Kamon, thanks for being on the show.
It's my pleasure. I love getting to network with other beekeepers. It helps me learn more about other people's individual situations, and I also learn a lot. I mean, I think a lot of people get the idea because I've got a YouTube channel and I've put on a conference now and a few things that I'm not in the stage of learning. Like all of a sudden I'm just some teacher and that's it. No, I'm constantly learning and getting to network with people like you. I learned something today, multiple things today that I may never have learned anywhere else. So it's my pleasure to be here.
Kamon, you do a great job on your video channel about showing the nuts and bolts of your method of beekeeping, what works for you, what doesn't work. You're also sharing other ideas. This year, you're doing things like an experimental yard where you're bringing all kinds of factors in that you're going to be kind of working with. And a lot of folks are starting to understand who you are as a beekeeper, and I really do appreciate the nuts and bolts approach. But sometimes what's hard for folks to get a good idea is who we are as people. What's inside the mind of the beekeeper? How did we get to this point? Where are we at? And kind of where do we see ourselves moving forward? There's a lot of things that happen all along the way that are trials, tribulations, that kind of get us to this point. And it's unfortunately easy for folks to see someone like you as being successful, doing well, a killer YouTube channel, and then they're measuring their life, their journey, their beekeeping, and their success as this is what they're trying to achieve. And while that's fantastic, and there's nothing wrong with that, I think there's some opportunities to dig in a little bit to the context of not only who we are, but why are we keeping bees? Why do we do the things that we do? And how did we get here?
Well, that's a loaded question to start with, but I'm up to the challenge. First of all, like you said, people get the idea that all these things are going, and it's been going for a while, and that's not the case. It's been the opposite. Starting out doing all the wrong things, and I've mentioned this on my YouTube videos, but we'll get into a little bit more detail. Beekeepers have to be tenacious. Bob Benny said that very thing, and they have to just keep going. It's hard, especially when you're new. It's not like getting into chickens or cows. It's complicated, and I definitely failed. I don't know if failed's the right term. I definitely made a lot of mistakes. I think failed is when you get into something and then you fail and give up. We definitely didn't give up. So we made a lot of mistakes. And my YouTube channel is basically just to help people make fewer mistakes. I'm hoping with this experimental yard that we can help tie our operation up a little bit tighter, so to speak. There's a lot of things that I feel like with varroa mites we just don't fully understand. A lot of people, and myself included, want to know more. But as far as starting out early, we definitely just had a really rough go of it. There were so many times, hundreds if not thousands of times, where Laurel and I just looked at each other like, should we keep doing this? And it was just a money sink, for lack of a better term. And we just pour money into it, and we eventually got out of that. But that's what my YouTube channel is all about, is being successful with bees. We all love it. They're so fun. My worst days in the bee yard, in the grand scheme of things, compared to other jobs that I've done, whether it's truck driving, working in a factory, or anything else like that, nothing to that level. So even a bad day in the bee yard is a good day to me. And even bee stings can be good for you. So it's apitherapy. It's all about terminology, right, and perspective. But definitely, my goal is just to help other people enjoy beekeeping to the extent that I do. And that doesn't mean you have to have hundreds of hives. You can maybe enjoy bees more than I do with 3 to 5. So that's what I'd like to see.
With whether it's 1 hive or 100 hive, a lot of folks are drawn to beekeeping. Maybe they even feel called to be a beekeeper. And it seems like the more folks that I meet, there definitely seems to be some folks that feel like there is a calling to be a beekeeper, because while there is the agricultural act of being a beekeeper, there is something special. There's a different kind of a relationship with the bees that you can have when you can't, if you're beekeeping and you haven't been humbled greatly, then I probably want to have your business card and see what those ShamWow secrets are, because that's just quite not the case. I'm sure you've had quite some humbling experiences as you got started. I'm sure if for folks that haven't caught your whole story on your YouTube channel, how did you get into beekeeping, and what were some of the greatest hurdles and pitfalls that you had early on?
Well, so just like any good marketing, it takes about 3 times to make a sale. And it took about 3 experiences with bees to make a sale with me. When I was a kid, I'd say probably about 7 or 8 years old, we went to a museum, and they had in the one huge wall these hexagon cells with pictures of larvae and bees and different things, honey and pollen in there. And that always really stuck out to me because it was just so alien, for lack of a better term, especially to a kid that had never seen anything like that before. And I've forgotten a lot of things about that museum, but that one really always stuck out to me. And you could get in those cells because they were probably about 2 feet deep. And, being 7, you could just literally sit in there. They were big enough. I could have taken a nap in that cell. So that was my first experience with bees. Of course, I didn't actually get serious for about another 8 years. And when I was about almost 15 years old. And I ran into this fella. I'm getting ahead of myself. I went to Fall Creek Falls with my dad at 13, and they had an observation hive there at the park, and that really blew me away watching the bees. And if you're not blown away, even if you're not into insects or anything agricultural, if you see bees in an observation hive and you're not blown away, or at least awestruck or even fear-struck or whatever,
right,
then there's something wrong with you. But so that really blew my mind. But then about a year and a half later, I was 14 and a half, I believe, there was a sorghum festival. I've always loved being outdoors. I always have been into trying to make a business go, even when I was a little kid. I just like creating and doing things and building. So that's what bees do. They're constantly trying to gain and reproduce and be productive. So when I went to a sorghum festival helping a guy make sorghum molasses, there was a guy that had another observation hive. But up to that point, I never had any local honey. I'd only had the garbage from some store or what's in a packet somewhere, and it was absolute garbage. I'm thinking, why in the world would Pooh Bear or anybody want to eat that stuff? It's gross. If that's what bees make, then why in the world would I want to fool with that? Well, there's much more to bees than just honey. But after tasting 2 different types of honey while I was there, I was sold hook, line, and sinker, and I had 5 hives of bees that I purchased a few months later, right around when I turned 15 in October. And so was my first impression on bees. And, it was just a local guy who had a few hives of bees. And, those little impacts right there are what got me into it. And also, I'd been kind of into growing, a lot of farm animals, processing free-range chickens, different things like that. So I was used to being outside. That's, again, what I wanted to do. And I just thought, wow, that would be a great addition to have to the farmers markets and stuff I'm doing, because people love honey. And now I do, too, because I've tasted the real stuff. And it is just daylight and dark difference from what's in the store. But what I did not realize was all the challenges that was going to take place shortly after getting into bees. It was an interesting time to get into bees because, let's see, it was, oh goodness, I don't know, early 2000s, somewhere around there, 2005, I can't remember the exact year. And, CCD was going on, a lot of misinformation. Oh, the bees are dying, everything's going to go extinct if we're not careful. And there's I think a huge rift created between professional beekeepers and hobby beekeepers because just everyone kind of took a political side on how they wanted to do their beekeeping, and that's the wrong attitude. I do believe we need people that are pushing the whole genetics, and people who are, the professionals who are doing pollination. We've got to have a lot of it, and some people disagree, but we can agree to disagree. But because of that, there was a lot of issues with education, and there was not any consistency in my area. And so I took to books, but books will only get you so far. I love to read, and I read every bee book I could get my hands on, and then turned towards the internet shortly afterwards, which you have to be careful there. Some crazy people on YouTube, I'm telling you. And we lost, out of those 5 hives, and I say we, I was the only one in my family crazy enough to fool with bees. My parents were supportive, but they were like, man, what is our son doing? Should we be concerned? That kind of stuff. And I lost 4 out of 5 hives. I purchased bees in October. I didn't know even how to access the hives at that point. Didn't even have a bee suit. But that's just a story of my life, kind of getting into things before I'm really ready.
At 15, you have 5 hives. But it sounds like your parents nurtured an environment they supported you starting off beekeeping.
My parents have always been very supportive. They always have given me constructive criticism, too. There's a difference between enabling and being supportive. And they felt like it could be good. There's been a few times they've taken me to the side and they're like, hey, this isn't working. You're going to have to figure something else out. Definitely not what I wanted to hear at the time, but it was good advice. But I wanted to build up this business. The bees wasn't initially a business. It was just kind of a side thing to go with my farmer's market stuff I was doing.
At 15?
At 15, yes.
So at 15, you're selling free-range chickens, and you have the idea of, I can value add at the farmer's market with honey.
Yes. We were doing tomatoes and some CSAs. And
your family was?
No, I was. My brother was helping me.
So you and your brother, at 15... are entrepreneurs, and you're starting a business. Your parents have had to play an incredible role on facilitating that kind of an opportunity.
They did. They never really pushed us into any of it, but whenever we showed a desire to work on whatever it was, they were very supportive of that. And so, my dad purchased a plow and did different things like that, and made sure that. He didn't give us ridiculous amounts of stuff, but he did whatever he could to help nurture whatever he felt like was a positive, creative thing. So, yeah, we were doing farmers markets. It wasn't anything grandiose at that period, but we were, you start young, and hopefully you'll figure it out before too long, and that's basically the story of my life. So, got into the bees that following spring. I only had 1 left. And I didn't even know. I read from books, but it's one thing to read in books about swarm control. It's another thing to actually be able to visibly read the combs and know what's going on, know when to take action, because the difference between a handful of days can mean all the difference in swarm season. And so I lost my first swarm, but it really hooked me because they swarmed and thankfully lit right into a cedar tree about 10 yards away. Climbed that tree and pulled still the biggest swarm of mine that to this point in my life. It was massive. It took 2 deep boxes to contain it, and I produced honey off of that colony in the first year. So I had 2 hives, and then I think only ended up with 1. So that was basically how things went. And then I purchased some packages after that, and then purchased more packages after that, and then purchased more after that because I was losing so many hives. I would say on average in my first 5 to 6 years, I was averaging somewhere between 60 and 80% losses, somewhere in there.
How much is that things that you look back that you could control, and how much of that you think was just part of the tuition at the school of hard knocks?
It was a combination of both. I didn't know what I was doing, and I didn't have a mentor. A lot of it was getting information that bees are just going to naturally take care of themselves because, we need to let things get back to nature. And that really, I was very susceptible to that message. And it's a very common one that's pushed because I've always been into healthy eating, organic foods. I would love to be able to keep bees as natural as possible. And when you read a lot of the old literature, that's what they did. Right. But they could. Times are very different now. And we have to consider that nature is not always benevolent. And I've learned that lesson over the years in agriculture and in bees. And so I wasn't feeding them sometimes when I should have. So I lost some colonies. I wasn't protecting some of the weaker ones. I was making splits with too few bees to cover the combs properly, and small hive beetles took them over. Some of the colonies, I was never treating for varroa in the early years. And then when I started treating, I was using products that were all natural, and some of those can be pretty rough if you don't use them correctly, like formic acid. I definitely couldn't raise my own queens, and so I was relying on whatever I could purchase, which is definitely hard. It's hard to find a reliable source of queens that actually give you quality. So there's a lot of factors that beekeepers have going against them early on when it comes to lack of education, all these new pests, and also just being able to control genetics, which, as you know, our kind of motto is great queens, dead mites, and good nutrition, which I believe are the 3 keys to overall success. There's little nuances within that, but I didn't understand any of those things at that point, and just literally sinking tens of thousands of dollars trying treatment-free. And I get this question a lot, what have you tried treatment-free? I mean, I've done everything from small cell to only raising. I started grafting queens around the time I was 18, 19 years old. Wasn't probably very good at it till I was probably early 20s, 21, something like that. But I was only raising queens from the survivors. And I was also when I did purchase bees, at that point I was purchasing from treatment-free new suppliers and different things who were supposed to actually know what they were talking about.
That's not a one-size-fits-all, though, is it?
It definitely did not fit me at all in any size. Maybe it works for somebody else, but they definitely can't get it to work for me. And that's a problem. And that's one of the reasons why I don't promote treatment-free beekeeping, as far as why I don't teach it, is because, one, if I can't do it myself, what in the world am I doing teaching?
You can't replicate it.
Yes. And it's got to be something that you can duplicate. And I've literally got tens of thousands of people that watch my videos, and they want to keep their bees alive. And whether you're a treatment-free beekeeper or someone who believes in crushing the mite souls, which I am one of those, you want your bees to be healthy coming out of the winter. And I don't see any good reason to let bees die. Even if you're trying to go for treatment-free, why let your bees die? Just identify the ones that are not quality for genetics, treat them, and remove them from the test or whatever you're trying to do, and keep them alive. And then you can requeen them with one you think that is better, and you can let those bees live. I think as beekeepers, part of our job is keeping our bees. And especially this day and age, the shift has been more in being less beekeeper and more bee haver, if we're just being honest here. And A lot of people don't like that, but it is true. If you're not keeping your bees and you're having to depend on somebody else or even nature to supply them, then are you really keeping bees? And some people would argue with that, and I think they're entitled to do that. But my definition of being a beekeeper is these are creatures that I have put into my equipment. Obviously, I feel I have a responsibility for anything that I am caretaking of. And so, to the best of my ability, I am going to help them not only stay alive, but to thrive, just as I would any other.
That's a huge difference.
It is a big difference. And I don't, if I have a dog or any other animal like that, I don't want to see them suffering from worms or anything like that and mange and being miserable. I want to see my bees in the same condition. The reason there's a big disconnect, I feel like, with people not treating bees the same as they do dogs and cats and horses is because you can't visibly see it and almost until it's too late. And a lot of people don't get in their hives enough to even know it's happening.
I think you and I come from similar starting points into agriculture, regenerative agriculture, holistic agriculture, permaculture, whatever name you want to call it, but trying to get back to the land, try to farm in a way to where we're mimicking nature rather than working against it. And it seems like this has popped up time and time again. And while there are certain times where that can be extremely effective and does work, there are other times where, and I get a lot of pushback from folks because I do consider my bees livestock. I consider it animal husbandry. You know, we had a situation when we were first going down the road and farming and raising animals for our own family table. You know, before I had the experience, I had the mentality that if I have pigs and if I'm going to farrow and I'm going to breed my own stock, well, if that pig gets sick, I'm going to let her die because I don't want those genetics on my farm. Now, that was my thinking early on before I had pigs. Everything is completely different when you're actually in the context, when you actually are responsible and you bring those animals to your place. And not only there's a certain amount of responsibility you have to another life form, there's that aspect, but there's a certain connection that you have when you're working within nature. In that, when you are the steward of that land, some folks take that responsibility a little bit different, to where we could argue that, well, farmers that are raising chickens in CAFOs are doing the best for those chickens because they're medicating feed and they're doing this and they're doing that. And it's one of those arguments that are never ending. But it seems like a lot of the mentality, for me personally speaking, thinking about animals like I did, to where if they're sick, then we call them and they don't exist in our context. That's a very idealistic way to go about that situation. And a similar story with yours is when I got into keeping bees, I came into it from the treatment-free, from the natural way to do it. And I thought that if God put these bees on this planet, then they magically have all of the answers against all the problems that they're going to have. Because why wouldn't they? They live in the forest. They live in the trees. They live in the wild. They don't need me to live. That was my brand new beginning beekeeper mentality, because I didn't understand the full context of a wild bee. I didn't understand the full context of the breeding cycles or the genetics of any other part of animal husbandry.
Well, you like me and many others chose to listen to that one side of the argument that fit kind of our narrative. And what we don't consider is that God also created a lot of things that no longer exist on this planet because they weren't able to adapt, or they're in a weakened state. You look at apple trees and different things like that that take a lot of maintenance. You know, people love roses. They have to be sprayed a lot and fertilized. There's a lot of things that need a lot more stuff than what they used to. And we live in a time period where people haven't always taken good care of the soil. So the soil's not as fertile as it used to be. So you have to use more supplements and things to help your plants thrive to their fullest potential. And it's a complicated topic because it's a split of kind of both of what you're talking about. First of all, we can't just say, okay, well, we can't do anything about the situation we're in, so we're just going to treat, and medicate. And that's not the answer. But also just going completely cold turkey and just like, okay, we're just going to let nature take its course. Well, nature is extremely brutal. So I think as beekeepers, we've got to actually find that middle ground, that fine line as much as possible. And there's going to be some variables there, and people can choose for themselves what exactly that means. To me, I think it takes a lot of thought, and being an adult means you have to really sit down and do a lot of thinking. I think that's why a lot of people avoid it with multiple distractions. When you are responsible for another creature or are responsible for a family or yourself, it takes a lot of thought, and it takes constant thought. It takes reevaluation. It takes also taking responsibility for the consequences of whatever you've chosen, which is not always, sometimes it's a bitter pill to swallow. And with bees, those learning curves are tough. It's easier to blame it and play the blame game in beekeeping. Oh, my neighbor sprayed Roundup on their fence row. Obviously that killed my bees. Or, oh, somebody else had varroa mites or less resistant bees and they mite bombed my hive or whatever. Well, I can't control anything about what my neighbor does. And I've gotten rid of that mentality. I focus on what can I control, and I focus on that really hard. And the more I've done that, the better my bees have done, the better I've done along with them. Where I find the line is we take it on an individual basis. Bees over time have really done a pretty good job getting pretty immune to tracheal mites. They still cause a little bit of issues, but not as much, but they're very different than the varroa mite. The varroa mites are definitely a lot harder and a lot rougher on the bees, and they definitely have been much harder to breed any resistance for. European foul brood and stuff like that, chalk brood, we totally select for that. We don't use antibiotics. We see queens that show any type of susceptibility to those things, and we get rid of those queens with extreme prejudice. Some people don't like that, but they do like our queens when we give them to them, because you're not going to have European foul brood issues, because we don't allow any of those to exist. We don't want those drones coming around. We don't want any of that. So I feel like, again, it comes down to really sitting down and thinking, and it's not something you can figure out in a day or even a year. It's a constant evolution of the mind. And talking to beekeepers who are like 40 years my senior or so, who have a lot of experience and are very successful. And I mean successful, they sell bees off because they just have too many of them. It's a problem. Like all these bees everywhere, because their bees are so well maintained, and they still have that mind where they're constantly learning and evaluating and adapting. And as a society, I think we've gotten away from this. That's one thing I had to learn. I had to change my mindset in my early 20s of, I've got to take responsibility for what's going on. I've got to sit down and stop guessing. I have to know what's going on in here. And first of all, it was learning that I need to feed better. I'm not feeding enough. I'm losing some colonies because they're starving, or they're going into winter with too little, and so they're not building as good a clusters going into winter, or mite problems are chipping away the percentages, or just wiping them out. And I was finding by and large that if I had a good clean colony in March, it usually was dead by October here. And that was very, very consistent, extremely consistent here. And there still isn't very good information on consistent mite control. And that was another thing. Okay, so we realized the mites are the problem. I adjusted my feeding. It took many years to straighten that out, and I'm still working on it every year, getting it more fine-tuned, trying new things out all the time, because beekeepers love to do that. And with the mites, it was then, okay, we know it's the mites. Now it's the treatments. Oh, now we have issues with the treatments. We've got to figure out those things. And I feel like it's part of it's no individual problem, but I feel like the beekeeping industry has kind of let us down. That's my personal opinion, that we should have better controls on this. I shouldn't have to be figuring this stuff out with my experimental yard. We should literally have a better idea how to use these treatments effectively and better information. So anyways, long story short, we lost a lot of bees to varroa, a lot to my own negligence, and a lot to queen problems. I'd say that's my number 2 problem. Varroa number 1, queen rearing, queen issues number 2. So
you mentioned good queens, dead mites, good nutrition, or I don't know, your mantra for successful beekeeping now. When you start off with the 5 hives, you are down to 1, you caught a swarm, you are building up the yard, you're buying packages, you're learning on the fly, you're paying your tuition to the School of Hard Knocks. A lot of folks who are trying to grow their passion into a business will find they get to a point to where it just feels like they're trying and they're digging in, but it always feels like it's one thing after another until sometimes we have a tipping point or a turning point where things all of a sudden they start to click and we start to have that realization like, aha, okay, now I think we're on to something. And then as a launch pad to get us to that next point. And maybe that's backyard beekeeper to small sideline scale. And then from sideline scale, we start to grow. And that's a whole can of worms. At what point do you recall having that aha moment or that tipping point to where you said, oh my gosh, okay, now this is starting to catch? Hey, can you help us out? Hit like, subscribe, share with all your friends, and be sure to check these great videos out too.